Wiggle your fingers, wiggle your toes, bend your knees and your elbows, and look and see if everybody is doing it too, just like you. Stop hopping up and down with your arms to the side, and flap them up and down like a butterfly, and look and see if everybody is doing it too, just like you. And if we all do the same, we'll all be together, moving around as one. And if we all do it now, we'll all be together, having a whole lot of fun, just like you.
Just like you. That is the catchiest song ever. Hello everybody and welcome to the Barnes Children's Literature Festival at home. There are so many of you here. It is so amazing. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Stephen. I'm one of the volunteers here. As you can see, I'm in my library today. Look who we've just had pop up. It's my great pleasure to introduce you all. And I want you to all cheer from wherever you are so we can all hear you. The amazing Emma Carroll.
Hey!
Woo! Amazing. Now, I can see you've all been answering loads of questions already, which is amazing. And you're all chatting, which is fantastic. There is a Ask the Question box. So pop your questions in there and we will answer them at the end of the chat. And now I'm going to give you over to Emma.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much. And we'll see you soon. Right. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here. Thank you ever so much for joining me. If you're at school, I hope that's all going really well. If you're not at school, you're probably lucky ones, actually. I hope you're having a good day too, and home learning and all that stuff you've been up to is doing okay. So I am here live in my little writing room. This is where it all happens. So you can see behind me a couple of posters on the wall there. Those are posters of my books. Big bookshelf. Not the only bookshelf I've got in my house. I've got loads of them. Little lighthouse behind me on the cupboard as well, because that was given to me by a friend of mine when I wrote Letters from a Lighthouse. So this is where it all happens. We haven't got any dogs with us yet. They might get a dog interrupting us halfway through, by the way. They're not here at the moment, but you never know with dogs. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about this book. It's my latest book. The books of other books of mine that you might know about are this one, Secrets of a Sun King, which some of you may have read, and Letters from the Lighthouse, which I think a few of you might have read as well. But today is going to be Tsunami Day. So if you have read this one, you probably are a bit of an expert already. If you haven't, then maybe it'll whet your appetite for a little bit of a story, bit of a news story. Okay, so we've got a little PowerPoint that's going to run alongside us, which has got a few pictures in it that I'm going to show you. So Richard is my lovely assistant. Now, Richard is out there somewhere in Cyberland, he's going to put up my PowerPoint, aren't you, Richard? Hi, Richard. There he goes, look. So if we go on to the first slide of that PowerPoint, that shows you all the books I've written. I've been quite busy, actually, over the last few years. But if we go on to the very first picture, Richard. Hello, Richard. Wakey, wakey. There he is. So the inspiration for this book. Now, some of you who are very clever will probably see that that wave on the cover there looks quite similar to the wave on that picture. And that's deliberate because that picture on the PowerPoint is a very famous painting called The Great Wave by a Japanese artist called Hokusai. And I love that picture. I've got a T-shirt with it on. I've got a poster of it out in my hallway. And when we were designing the cover for the Somerset Tsunami, I said to the artist, do you know that painting? Because it's actually one of my favorites. And I'd love it if somewhere on our cover we can kind of, mention that painting in some way. So that's what he's done. So the inspiration for this story came from my local county, my local home county. So have a little think about that. Think about where you live and think about things that might have happened historically in your, around where you live, around your town. Now, this flood that was the inspiration for my book happened about 20 miles away from where I live. And it happened in 1607. So we're talking a really long time ago. We're talking about the time when Shakespeare was around, James I was on the throne. So it's a long old time ago, and it's still in the history books. It's still, you can research it online. And what you'll discover quite quickly is a lot of people died in this flood. Like 2,000 people died in this flood and lost their homes and lost their livestock and things like that. And the flood affected Somerset, Devon, South Wales, and around the Bristol area. Now, that in itself is quite worthy of a story, I guess, surviving something like that. But when I looked at it in a bit more detail, I realised that actually a couple of geologists, a couple of people working at university in Bath, had done some research into this flood and realised that maybe it wasn't just any old flood, it could have been a tsunami. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide then. There's our Richard, he's there somewhere. Thank you, Richard. Oh, hello. Okay, so the sorts of things you find out about this flood feel quite old-fashioned and quite old. And this picture here I'm showing you on the screen is what's called a woodcut. It's an old picture of the event. And you can see there are people climbing trees to escape the water, animals swimming around. It was an incredibly deep flood that came up to the roof of the church in this particular village. So big, big, big flood. But these two geologists also started reading some of the things that people had written about this flood. And one of the things they came across was this description of the sea and the sea disappearing and then coming in again faster than a greyhound could run. Now, that description for me is just lovely. I love it. And it's always because dog reference, obviously. But it's also telling you that the sea was behaving in a very odd way. Okay, on we go to the next picture then, Richard, please. I've got a bit of an echo going on here. I just want to say that. I don't know if anybody listening has. I've got a delay and an echo. So, Richard, if you can do anything about that, that would be fabulous. But don't worry if you can't. So, look at this picture. Is that a real wave? You might be thinking, is that actually a tsunami? Because that's what comes up on Google when you research tsunamis. This was one of the first pictures that came up. And it isn't. Which is one of the things I found out quite quickly, was the fact that actually tsunamis don't look like that. That's a sort of Hollywood tsunami. That's a kind of CGI tsunami, this big one wave that comes in and swamps cities. So, Richard, if we go on to the next slide, we'll see some more real life pictures. If you can have a little double click there, that'd be fab. They're coming up. Slowly. So these are two pictures from real life tsunamis. The one on the left-hand side of your screen with the cars is from Japan, and the one on the right is from Thailand. And what you can see is that water, when it comes in, is more like a flood, like a surge of water, really powerful surge of water rather than a wave. Okay, so that's what we're thinking of in our heads. Now, these geologists who were researching this flood about 20 years ago, they realised that something must have happened to trigger this tsunami. And very quickly, they realised there had been an earthquake under the sea off the coast of Ireland that may well have triggered this tsunami to come up the Bristol Channel. Okay. So if we can move on to our next slide, that would be great. Thank you very much. Now, the first thing I'm going to do before we go any further, before we get any further into the story, is I better introduce you to my characters in this story. So the story, my story that's about a girl who survives this tsunami, who actually sees it happen, is a girl called Fortune. Now, where did that name come from, you might think? Well, here is my trusty notebook. And whenever I'm going to write a story, I always buy a notebook. That's kind of the essence of everything I write goes into a notebook. And if you can see that, it's a really bad drawing on that first page, but there's also a list of names. Now, I started looking up names for people who would have been alive in 1607, and girls' names I've got here. And I've got Fortune at the top of the list, Anne, Eleanor, Abigail, and decided from there, well, Fortune's a really good name for a heroine in a story because she has good fortune and she has really bad fortune as well. So Fortune, this was right at the very start of writing the book where I decided I was going to have a girl in my story called Fortune. There's also a name, Susanna there, Beatrice, that's another name that turns up in the story, and Ellis is another name that turns up in the story. So researching those names is quite an important start. Now, this is the first page of the book, and this opening page, I don't know if you can see, that's actually back to front, isn't it? The opening page says a few months earlier, in which our hero's life takes a strange and dramatic twist. And this is what happens. So this is, if you can just imagine, this is Fortune's village. This is where she lives. We lived in a hamlet called Fairmaiden's Lane, which wasn't a lane at all, but half a dozen moss-roofed cottages cowering against the weather. For as long as I could remember, there'd been no grown men amongst us, just women, girls, and my brother Jem. As for fair maidens, there was Abigail, my elder sister, though she was only middling pretty. Our women folk were a capable lot, breeding pigs, catching fish, crushing herbs and birthing babies in the local towns and villages, and had a reputation for doing all of it well. Yet we were our own little community, bounded by the Severn Sea on one side, the Quantock Hills on the other, and because none of us needed rescuing, like maidens in stories had you believe, our hamlet's name became a fine joke. No harm was meant by it, at least not then. So Fortune lives in a village where it's mostly run by women, and it's only her brother who's the male there, and he's a very gentle soul, and he doesn't really want to be in charge, but he eventually becomes promoted in the village because there are witch hunters around. And I don't know what you know about witch hunting. You may well have watched a Doctor Who episode where there was stuff about witch hunting in it. But James I, who was the king at this time, was very interested in witches. And of course, a lot of the people who ended up being kind of blamed for things as witches were women. So my main character, she first of all has this encounter with the sea, if we want to put it that way. She's decided that she wants to leave her village and she wants to go to sea. But actually, events take over and she realizes that she's going to have to go to work for a living. So this is what happens to her next. So she goes to work in a big house that's near the sea, and she's looking after a boy called Ellis. Now, this family that she goes to work for, the Spicers, are very wealthy. And we're going to talk a little bit in a minute about where that wealth comes from, because it's actually incredibly relevant when we think about what's happened in the news in Bristol this weekend. Okay, so this is my next little reading for you. And this is when Fortune arrives at the house of Mr. Spicer, and she's taken up the stairs by the housekeeper to meet Ellis, who's the boy she's going to be looking after. We were halfway up the stairs when the yelling started. "Get that hook away from me! I'm warning you!" It was coming from a bedchamber up on the first floor and made me freeze mid-step. "The devil is that?" I asked. "Oh, it's Master Ellis again making a fuss," Mistress Bagwell replied, and kept climbing the stairs as if it was all perfectly normal and people hollered their lungs out here every day. So this was the boy I'd been sent to toughen up, though by my reckoning he sounded fierce enough already. was beginning to wonder what sort of house I'd come into. At the door to Master Ellis's bedchamber, Mistress Bagwell turned to me. "He's not a bad boy," she said, softening. "His father sometimes forgets he's feeling the loss of his mother." The door swung open onto a room that smelled of blood. Glimpsing round Mistress Bagwell's shoulder, I couldn't see a boy, never mind a bleeding one. I took in the high bed with its tapestried hangings, the leaping fire, the wood of the tables, walls, floor, all polished to perfection. And then the tooth barber. He was by the window. Despite being rather short, he managed to block out a good deal of light. "Just a back tooth removed today," he said to Mistress Bagwell. He had a strong local accent, soft and meadowy, which was at odds with the blood on his bare forearms. "More teeth cleaning, less sugar eating. That's what this young man needs." Mistress Bagwell sucked in her cheeks like she didn't agree. "Very good, Dr. Blood." The name was fittingly grim. Okay, we'll stop there. Now, that name, just for your that name came from my dentist. I actually had a dentist growing up called Mrs. Blood, and she was very nice. She wasn't a nasty dentist at all, but it is actually a Somerset surname. And I thought that's a really good name for somebody who's not a very nice character. Now, first and foremost, Dr. Blood is a dentist, what they called tooth barbers in the 17th century. And we're going to talk in a minute about why dentists became more popular later on, or became more of a necessity. But first of all, let's go back to witches. So Dr. Blood is also involved in witch hunting, as is Mr. Spicer. Okay, so Richard, if we could move on the next slide then, please. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so what's this got to do with the tsunami? Where's she going with all this? Well, when you're writing a book, you can't just have one thing happening, can you? You've got to have more than one big event. Otherwise, once that tsunami's happened, what's going to happen then? So I was thinking, all right, well, Fortune survives the tsunami. Oh, a bit of a spoiler. But what happens to her after that? Is there something even worse that she has to endure? So I thought, okay, what else was going on in the 17th century? And you come across the idea of witches and witchcraft. Now, Fortune's quite an unusual girl. So she's the sort of person who might have got the attention of people looking for witches. Also, you've just had this tsunami happen, which is, you know, an incredibly dramatic, unusual thing. And people who didn't understand geology, who didn't understand why that wave had happened, would have been looking for someone to blame. They might have decided, oh, somebody's been practicing witchcraft. Somebody's been putting spells on the sea. So that's where I started going. Now, this picture you've got here on the screen now, which looks like it's got a nice tea stain on it. It hasn't. That's part of PowerPoint. Another woodcut, another one of these funny old-fashioned pictures that's showing somebody being tried for a witch. And as you can see, they've got this horrible-looking device, which is called a ducking stool, which would put you in the water. And if you sank and drowned, then you were innocent, which is obviously very helpful because by that stage you have drowned. But if you floated, that was a sign that evil spirits had helped you. So then you would be named a witch, and then you would have been tried as a witch. So it's a terrible, terrible torture implement. It's a terrible thing that happened to lots of women across Europe and men in England. And that's something that I sort of wanted to bring into my story, even though it's quite grim. Because we quite like grim things in stories sometimes, don't we? But also, just bear in mind that if you can say yes to any of these questions, you too might have been considered a witch if you'd been alive at the time my story is set. So if you have ever taken a vitamin tablet, i.e. a herbal medicine, if you have a cat for a pet, if you can speak a foreign language, if you, I'm just trying to remember, left-handed. Any of those things were considered odd and unusual. And if somebody was to blame for something, or somebody was looking for somebody to blame for something, that could have been one of those things. So bear that in mind. So think yourself lucky. We're living through a pandemic, but at least nobody's going to accuse you of being a witch. So that's a good thing. Right, on we go then, Richard, please. Next slide. So, here we go. Right. Think back then, please, to the passage that I just read you about the tooth barber. And you'll get an idea of what this picture is all about. Now, it looks like a candle or a funny shaped donut. Or somebody once said to me, "Oh, is that earwax?" That is raw sugar. And those are how sugar used to be packaged many years ago. So it's what's called a sugar cone before it's processed and made into the lovely white stuff that you put in your cakes. So why have we got sugar? Well, this is what, right at the very end of the book, Fortune calls sugar. I'm just trying to find the bit in the book for you. Fortune calls it the white devil, because that's what people called it at that time, because sugar was the thing that everybody wanted, and it was very expensive. It tasted like nothing you'd ever had before. It was just exquisite, like heaven in your mouth. But only the really rich people could afford it. So people like Ellis Spicer, who's got a bad tooth, he's been eating quite a lot of sugar. And having teeth that weren't great was a sign that you could afford to eat sugar. So it almost was a bit of a kind of status symbol to have bad teeth, which is a bit weird. So sugar became a very, very desirable thing in the 17th century. Now you're thinking, okay, so where's she going with this then? Well, where does sugar come from? And how does that relate to the news at the weekend? Well, you can probably answer this yourselves, but I can tell you. So sugar is grown in hot countries. So it's grown in places like America, southern South America, the Caribbean. And to grow sugar, it was needed to bring a very big workforce to work the land. And what a lot of Europeans did, because they knew they were going to make an awful lot of money from this, was ship people, take people against their will. So kidnap them, really. That's what we're talking about. And traffic them across the Atlantic. So take them from West Africa and trafficked across the Atlantic to work the sugar plantations. So where's the business of what happened in Bristol got to do with this then? Well, because the chap whose statue they pulled down was what's called a slave trader. So he was somebody who made an awful lot of money through taking people from their homes in West Africa and sailing them across the ocean to sugar plantation owners in America. So anyone who was part of that trade, anyone who was growing sugar, anyone who's making a lot of money sending people across the Atlantic to work on the sugar plantations, was making money, and lots of money, out of black people who were taken against their will from their homes in West Africa to work the land. So that's what we call that, the slave trade. And that's why people were very unhappy about that statue at the weekend, because it was honouring somebody who'd made a lot of money from trafficking people. So it's amazing, really, when I think, gosh, I wrote this book last year and that news story came up, and it's a really big part of our history, that sugar trade, the sugar trade, and how we treat people from different cultures. So it's really worth having a think about that and having a look into that if you're at home and you've got some time. Okay, on we go then. Let's have a look at another slide then, please, Richard. So what have we got next? Oh, we got James I in his lovely trousers. So James I, as we've said, if we can go on to the next slide as well. James I is the man who was on the throne at this time, and he was quite an odd fellow in many ways. He was very clever, or he thought he was very clever, and wrote a lot of books about witches and things like that, and was very interested in this idea that certain people had evil living in them. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, please, Richard. He was also famous for lots of other things. So he was famous for being the first king of England and Scotland together. He wrote a book on witches. He influenced Macbeth, the Shakespeare play. Shakespeare apparently wrote it because he knew the king was really interested in witches, and that's why there's 3 witches in it. And he also oversaw translation of the Bible, the King James Bible. So he is quite a big figure in history, and he turns up in my book as well. He turns up at the very end with a big ring on his finger that one of the characters takes a fancy to. And he sort of, in a funny kind of way, sort of helps our character out. Certainly sort of saves the day in many ways. But she sort of manages to do that herself as well. Okay, right, on we go. So Richard, next slide, please. Okay, so a book needs to be written, doesn't it? Now, I've already showed you a little bit of this already. So if we can go on to the next slide. What have we got there? Richard, next slide, please. Hello, Richard. Calling Richard. Oh, okay. Right. Oh, hang on. Go back one. Thank you. There we are. So, really, really important when you've got your ideas and you're ready to start writing. The first thing I showed you was a notebook. So this is the notebook for the writing of the Somerset Tsunami. And it's full of scribbles, bits and pieces, random things that won't make sense to anybody but me. But that's what you do when you're writing a book, or I do. It's like all my ideas go in there. And if ever I get stuck, if ever I'm thinking, oh, I don't know what to do next, then it's all in here. So notebooks are really important. And I've got lots of notebooks. So I've got another little notebook here. And this is the sort of one that might go in my bag, that might be by my bed. Oh, I've got more notebooks over here. Look, da, 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 da. So notebooks are a huge part of a writer's life. The other thing, and you can see I've got one on that slide here, but this is the real life version. Oops, spilling tea everywhere now. This is a mug of tea, a big mug of tea, and it really, really needs to be a big mug of tea. Okay, so tea really helps writing. Over here, you'll notice it's the same plate as well. I made this for you earlier because I thought you might like to try it. And look at that. This is my favourite writing snack. Okay, and I'm just going to talk you through it. You probably heard me say this before, but I don't think, you know, when something's worth saying, it's worth saying more than once. This isn't toast, actually. This is bread. But bread, butter, Marmite, peanut butter, cucumber. Okay. Now, I'm going to have a little bite of this. Just to prove to you that it's nice. It's sort of salty, sort of savoury, crunchy, all those amazing things. So those of you who like eating peanut butter with things like jam or banana, it just takes your peanut butter in a different direction. Lovely. So if we had a dog here now, a dog would be sitting down here watching us, but luckily we don't have a dog, so all that is still there for me to eat. So we have snacks. Snacks are really, really important when you're writing because you need to keep your brain fed. Okay, on we go to the next slide then, please. Okay, so the next slide is showing you something, and you'll be thinking, what's that? That looks a bit boring. When you're writing, you have to edit. Okay, so it's never just about sitting down and your story. There's always crafting and thinking about things and deciding that, no, that character's got to go, that character's no good, or thinking, that's a bit boring, that bit, I think we'll get rid of that. So edits are really, really important when you're writing. I mean, I will probably write a book about 4 or 5 times before it actually goes to a printer and be printed. So something that you've read like this, I mean, this is a really good example, actually. This book, the first draft of it, the first version I wrote of it, Letters from Lighthouse, was really quite dreadful. It really wasn't very good at all. And I had to do a lot of work on it, and it changed quite dramatically. The character of Esther became much more developed in the second draft of this book than the first draft. So drafting is really, really important. Okay, on we go. Next slide then, please. Is it there? Oh, it's coming. Oh, there they are. Look, you did wonder when they might be appearing. So if you've got pets and you've been doing your schoolwork at home during lockdown, you'll totally get this. That when you're trying to work and you're sitting down and it's all quiet and nice and chilled and you're really focusing, there's nothing nicer than a little furry friend to sit there with you. And I really, really love my dogs for that, because what they do is they love it when you sit down. They love it when you're just staying in the same spot for quite a long time and there's a lap there or there's a bit of peanut butter going on. So having a pet is really lovely when you're a writer, because it just feels like you've got another person in the room with you. I know not people, but you know what I mean. So the one on the left, who's the hairy one, is Olive. And Olive is named after Olive from Letters from the Lighthouse. I often get asked that. Oh, is Olive named after your dog? No, it's the other way around. So Olive was bought as a puppy when I had written the first draft of Letters from the Lighthouse. So that's why she's called Olive, and she is a total pest. I mean, I love her, but she is a pest. And she likes sitting on the table and looking at you like that. The other one is Bertie, and he's a bit older. I'd like to say he's more sensible, but if you've got a Jack Russell, you know that's a bit of a loose term, because they're not that sensible. But he's very good at finding things. And the other day, I'll tell you this, my husband took him out for a walk and he disappeared. He was on his lead, but he dived into a hedge and he came out with a fox cub in his mouth, a live fox cub. And he was holding it like a mum dog would hold the puppy, and he dropped it down at my husband's feet. And the fox cub went back into the hedge again, and he was fine. But yeah, so that's my dogs. They're nutters, but they really help me with my writing. Okay, are we going to have another picture? I think we might. Oh, let's have a look. It's gone a bit. Oh, a high-vis jacket. This is my last slide, actually, to show you. But when you've done all that peanut butter eating and hanging out with your dogs and sitting in this little room here doing your writing, eventually it's done. And there is a real moment of satisfaction when you get to see your book for the first time. And this was me in a big warehouse that's a bit like the biggest IKEA you've ever been to. And it's all it's got in its books. And there was my books on the shelf. And that was the first time I saw them. I then had to sign 2,000 copies of that book, which took quite a long time, actually. That took a fair few hours and about 5 pens. But seeing your book in the flesh for the first time is really, really exciting. Now, this is my 10th book. So you think, oh, she might have got a bit used to it by now. But you don't. You never do. It's always like, oh, how exciting when you see your book in the flesh for the first time. Okay. Right. So I've been rabbiting on for quite a long time. I've been talking for about 35 minutes. We're a bit ahead of ourselves. But apparently, according to our hosts, we have had a lot of questions from you lot. And I reckon it's about time we answer them, don't you? Stephen, what do you reckon?
I reckon we should get into it.
Yeah. Are you echoey?
I'm a little bit echoey.
I'm really echoey. I'm about
like 5 seconds behind. I just
I'm like,
pretend we're ghosts. It's okay.
like that.
We're going to start off with a question from Bexley Bookworms, who want to know.
Bexley
your-
Bookworms,
See?
woo!
You're famous. They would like to
You
know what your
are.
favourite books were when you were younger.
Oh, Bexley Bookworms. Do you know what? I've got one of them on the shelf. Let me go and get it for you. I love that question. And oops, hang on. I'm going to take my computer with me over here, and I'm going to show you. Here it is. My favourite book in the whole world is this one. And it's called, you probably can't see it because it's back to front, For Love of a Horse. And it's by an author called Patricia Leach. Now, the naughty thing about this book is it actually isn't my book. When I opened it the other day, I realised that it belonged to somebody called Kate Jones. So, Kate Jones, I'm really sorry that I obviously got your copy of this book. Kate Jones was somebody I went to primary school with. And obviously I snuck her copy of For Love of a Horse. But it's the best adventure story. There's a series of 12 of these books. And you must think, oh, horses, really? But it's not like your normal horse book. It's all very mystical, and they go galloping across the moors, and she lives in this big old house and rescues this horse from the circus. That's what happens in this first book. And they're just the best stories. I bought them, apart from this one, obviously, because it's Kate Jones's, but I bought the whole series again off eBay when I was at the ripe old age of about 40, because I wanted to read them again. And I think that's the beauty of brilliant children's books, is you can just read them any time in your life, really. And this book is one of those, well, the whole series is one of those. So I hope that answers your question.
Definitely.
So yeah.
I'm also loving your bookshelves. They're just fantastic to look at.
Well, they are, yeah.
That's
That's just a very small
tip
slice.
of the iceberg.
Yeah, it is. Really.
Eliza,
I think if you took the books out of my house would fall down.
Oh, same here.
Yeah.
Question number 2.
Yes.
Eliza would like to know what inspired you to start writing.
Eliza. Hello, Eliza. Well, first of all, Eliza, my niece is called Eliza, and I love that name. And I have a character called Eliza in my very first book, which is named after her because it's one of my favourite names. So thank you for your question. I've forgotten what it was now.
What inspired you to start writing?
What inspired me?
Yes.
Okay. So I've always loved English. So at school, even at primary school, it was always my favourite subject. When I say favourite subject, I mean I was rubbish at maths, basically, and I still am. So I always had that kind of brain that was much more sort of into creative things and storytelling and stuff like that. So when I got to secondary school, I had a lovely English teacher called Mrs. Bailey, and she really did inspire me. She pushed me on because she knew that I had this real spark for English. So I always say her, actually. She was the person who really made the difference, I think. And my mum and dad, because they used to take me to the library quite a lot and get books and things. But Mrs. Bailey, I would say, my English teacher, Amazing. She had a really big impact on how much I loved English and how much I love writing.
That was my school librarians to me. They were like the best people ever.
Yeah. Those people who really know how much it means to you, and they kind of really nurture it in you.
Yeah.
They're so special, those people, aren't they? They're so valuable to you.
Completely. Our next question. So you talked a little bit about your writing process, but how long did it take you to actually write a book from first draft to kind of the last draft?
Okay. It sort of depends how long you've got, really. So my first book, because I was still a teacher at that time, I took about 18 months maybe to write it, and I was kind of learning how to do it as well. But usually it takes about sort of 4 to 6 months to write a first draft, and that's to kind of get it in a shape where you're prepared to show somebody, and then probably about another 4 months to edit it. And that's with your editor at your publishers, who kind of says, okay, and they're pretty hard taskmasters.
But for good
editors.
reason.
Sorry, go on.
For good reason, though.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. But they really don't let any, you can't get anything past them. You know, they're sort of like, no, this isn't quite as good as it could be. No, you still need to. And I love that about my editor, that she really, really pushes me to make sure it's as good as it can be. And even to the point where sometimes she'll say, okay, we're going to have to put publication back because it's still not as good as it could be.
Yeah, they're amazing. They do they're like magic. They just change it completely.
It's a really special job. It's amazing how they know.
It's a hard job.
How to sort of nudge you on. Yeah.
Do you have a particular writing style, or like kind of way that you do it in the morning? Do you do it in the evening? Do you write in big chunks?
I'll be honest, I'm not very good first thing in the morning. I'm not what you call a morning person. I like to get up quite slowly. I think it's after years of teaching, of getting up, you know, at goodness o'clock in the dark and staggering into school and being there in front of a 30 year nines. Yay, year nines on a Sunday, on a Monday morning. That was my favourite. And you could be teaching by 8:45. Now nowadays I kind of having my first cup of tea at 8:45. So really I kind of like to have a spell of time where I can get into the writing. I'm not very good at writing in short chunks. I like to sort of sit and relax into it. So really any time of day, as long as it's daylight. So go on.
No, completely. So with that in mind, how do you factor in things like research? So Katie has asked, for instance, have you visited Egypt? Which was that the inspiration for Taking Up the Sun King, and all the stuff you had today on Richard James I, which was amazing. Where do you kind of pull that from?
Some of it you do before you start writing, because you want to think, is there a story here? Is there enough here? Because often history will give you little nuggets of stuff that you can spin into a story. Sometimes you research as you go along. I do a bit of both, because otherwise, if you kind of research everything at the start, it kind of kills your creative buzz, really. You're kind of thinking, oh, I've got to write a history book now, haven't I? You know, so it's nice to find little things as you go along. With Katie's question, yes, I did go to Egypt. It was a long time ago. It was in 1994, early 1994, after I finished university. And it sort of stayed with me, that visit, because it's an amazing country. If you ever get a chance to go to Egypt, it is a very, very interesting place. And yeah, I'm really intrigued by that sort of discovery of the tomb and what was going on in the world at that time. So this was a really good, fun book to write. I loved writing this book. So I did do a bit of research into that, but there was a lot of stuff, Katie, in Secrets of the Sun King that I didn't know about before I started writing it. I didn't know that part of Tutankhamun's body was missing, and reading that was an example of one of those little nuggets of history that you think, oh, so if that was missing, where was it and why was it missing? So that was really helpful when writing this story.
That's so cool. Chloe has asked, do you find if any of your characters have personality traits of yourself?
Well, Chloe, watch out. You might be in one of my books if you're not careful. So, yes, I think that is true. I think that's probably true for a lot of writers, actually. That's not to deflect the question away from myself. But I think it's always the case that you use bits of yourself and bits of people you know when you're writing. I wouldn't wholesale say, right, this character here is just like my brother. You know, he's got all my brother's character traits. I wouldn't do that. What I would do is say, okay, well, my brother's really into music, so this character's going to be really into music. But my dad really likes running, so he's going to be into music, but he likes running. So you take traits and you sort of plap them together. So you sort of made a different person, if you like. I often write in the first person, so I often write as if I'm that person. And I would probably say that what I was like at the age of my narrators, what was I like when I was about age 12? I would probably say I was most like Tilly Higgins in Frost Hollow Hall. So Tilly Higgins is a bit of, she's a bit gobby, she's a bit bolshy, she's a bit, gets things wrong all the time and then gets quite cross about it. So yeah, I think Tilly probably has quite a lot of my character traits in it. I'd like to say I've calmed down a bit now, but I expect somebody who knows me would put me straight on that one as well.
So if you bring kind of people's traits in, do you also bring memories in from when you were younger?
Yes.
Do you like?
Yeah, very much so. So going back to that first book, Frost Hollow Hall, the story is about a girl who goes off on a dare to go ice skating on a lake that's frozen over. And the idea of that story came from my mum, who was always telling me when I was growing up, don't you go anywhere near any frozen water, don't you go near the river, don't you go, you know, like that kind of constant anxious mum telling you not to do things. And that sort of rubs off on you sometimes when your mum says things like that to you, because you start thinking, why, what's going to happen? And because I had quite an active imagination anyway as a child, I was fascinated by this idea of what would happen if you went through ice, and what would it be like if you got trapped underneath the ice, because that's what she was telling me was going to happen. If you fall through, you won't be able to get out again. So that became an idea for the story. Well, what would you see if you fell through ice? What would it look like from underneath? What would be down there with you? So yeah.
Ooh, I love that. Anetta has asked, what scenes do you find the hardest to write?
Scenes?
Yeah, or even characters or like kind of situations.
Yeah, I believe it or not, opening chapters are quite hard to write, because you obviously have to write an opening chapter at some point. But one of my tutors, when I was doing a creative writing MA, one of my tutors said to me, you can't really write a proper opening chapter until you've written the end, because then you know how it all resolves. So often with an opening chapter, I'll be rewriting it quite a lot as the story sort of changes as it goes along. So at the moment, I'm editing a book and I know it ends and I'm nearly there, but the opening chapter is still quite frayed and quite bitty, because I really need to nail the ending before I can nail the beginning, if that makes sense, because the beginning has to echo the ending. And of course, if you haven't written the ending yet, you can't really write a great beginning. So yeah, beginnings, opening chapters.
I completely agree with you.
And I do find those quite hard sometimes.
110%. It's on the back of that, this is like kind of a flip question. Have you ever started books that you just haven't finished?
No, I haven't.
That's really good.
And I think that's because, apart from Frost Hollow Hall, which I wrote as a dissertation on a university course, so I had to finish it. Every other book I've written, touch wood, she says, grabbing something quick, has been under contract, which means a publisher has already bought it before it's been written. So you've got someone waiting for it. So you have to get on with it, and you clear with them, or you give them an idea of what the book's going to be about before you start writing. You say, oh, I want to write a book about a circus. And they're like, okay, go on then. So off you go. Or, oh, I want to write a book about Frankenstein. Okay, off you go. So yeah, so I haven't yet had that experience, but I'm sure it's going to happen.
A lot of your books are set in real places. So like, for instance, as we were talking about the tsunami, it's kind of in the Bristol sort of Devonshire areas. And there are a lot of like places that exist in the books. Do you base these places off real buildings, real like manor houses or places, or do you kind of make it up completely?
A bit of both. So some of those locations will be recognizable, and people will be able to go, oh yeah, I went there, or I know what that's like, or I can imagine that in my head. And some of it will be very different. So some of the buildings won't be the same buildings, because it's like in the Somerset Tsunami, there's a big manor house that they all live in that's right on the seafront. that gets destroyed by the tsunami. Now, I don't know if that house actually existed or not, but there would have been big timber built houses with, you know, thatched roofs and what have you that didn't survive. And there'll be buildings like that just have fallen down anyway over time. So, you know, there were people living in this country hundreds and hundreds of years ago, but the buildings they lived in don't survive. So yeah. So if you're writing in the past, quite often a lot of my buildings are sort of from my imagination. So it's a bit of both, really.
That's completely fair. So do you draw your inspirations from a lot of places around you when you're walking? Like you said, you joked about maybe writing a Frankenstein book. Do you see something and go, I want to write this and I want to write that, or I want to write about? Yeah,
very much so. I think that's how your inspiration sort of gets you sometimes. You sort of think, oh, that'd be a good story, wouldn't it? So like I love little spooky stories. So creepy things that happen. Got this book downstairs called Somerset Murders. And it's got all these really horrible, grisly things that happen to people in it. And I just love things like that.
This is the common theme for you. This is great.
Yeah. But I also, I do like drawing from places that have a kind of quite a importance in my heart, you know, that I kind of feel real connection to. Yeah.
So off that, what was we've had a very popular question that was, what was the inspiration for Letters to the Lighthouse? We haven't talked about that too much yet.
No. So Letters was inspired by my mother-in-law, who lives just up the road from me, and she came to Somerset from the East End of London. So she was an evacuee in 1941, and it was her talking to me one afternoon about being an evacuee and how they didn't have any sweets and how they used to chew on candlesticks because that tasted like bubblegum.
My nan's told me that, yeah.
As she told you that as well.
Yeah.
I was like, that is so random. And then she started telling me about all the other food, you know, that they couldn't get hold of and things they ate instead. And I just thought, this is just fascinating. I really, really would like to write a story about this. So that's where it came from originally. And the village that I live in had evacuee children at the village school. And it was around the time I was writing this, around the time where there was a lot in the news about Syrian refugees, and Donald Trump had just been elected, and all those sorts of things were going on. And there just felt like there was quite a lot of kind of negative stuff in the world, and people weren't being very kind to each other. And it made me think about a time in history where people did open their homes and their hearts to people who were fleeing from war. And it made me feel like, well, we can do this. We have done this before. We have welcomed people into our lives and our hearts because they need somewhere to be. So what's the difference? What's the difference now? So that's kind of why I thought I really wanted to write a wartime story, because I thought that kind of, the story's about taking people in who need your help, and how we're very good at doing that. And we have done, you know, we've done it in the past, and it's really helped an awful lot of people. So that book was inspired by all those things going on at the time, really. It was also the hardest of my books to write, I have to say, partly because the first draft was rubbish, and also just because there's some quite harrowing things that happen to the characters, which were based on sort of real events. And I really, really did cry when I was writing this book. It really did upset me. So I have quite a lot of messages from teachers who say, oh my goodness me, when I had to read the ending, you know, I had my tissues handy. I think, yeah, me too. You know,
always good to have a good cry, though.
Yeah, I think it is, actually. I think you realise that when you're writing, you think, actually, if I'm feeling this, then you really hope that someone else might kind of pick up on that as well.
Hopefully. We got time for a couple more, I think. Yeah, we're good. Richard has asked, you're not just a writer, you've done other things. What other jobs have you had? So I have been a teacher. That was my main job. I was an English teacher at a secondary school in Devon. So I used to teach students from year 7 up until year 13. So I did that for about 18 years. And I stopped being an English teacher when In Darkling Wood came out. So In Darkling Wood is my third book. So for about
3 years I was being an English teacher and an author at the same time. And that was quite interesting. Not least because I always remember being asked once in a lesson, quite a difficult class, a year 8 class. And they always used to have this way, students, you'll know this, students yourselves, that little trick of keep the teacher chatting about something that she likes to talk about so she won't make us get on with our work. So my students used to like asking me about my books. And I remember one boy asked me one day, has anybody actually bought any of your books? And I said, yeah, my mum. And that shut him up.
It's always the mums that buy the books first, though.
Yeah,
Always
absolutely. That's so true. So I was a teacher. Before I became a teacher, I did some quite boring jobs. Not really very interesting. That sort of made me think I need to do a job. I think it's quite important, actually, what you do during the day when you're working, because when you're at school, the day sort of flies by. But when you actually go out to work, you realise that you've got to spend all this time doing one thing. Mm-hmm. And you quite quickly realise that quite a few jobs that you spend all day doing aren't that interesting. I did pick avocados in Israel. Wow. That was quite interesting. But the most boring job ever that I've ever had was, and lasted 4 days doing it, was in a factory, putting pieces of file paper into a machine and pulling the lever down and putting holes in the paper. So when you get file paper with holes punched in it,
we have you to thank for that.
A big machine to do it now, but back in whenever that was, 20 odd years ago, it was me doing it, punching the holes in your file paper.
Amazing.
So yeah,
that is a very strange tangent. This is my favourite question. It comes from the Queen's School. They would like to know if you have a favourite word, because one of their favourite words is discombobulate.
Ooh, that's a nice word. Do you know what my favourite word is? Is crisp.
Why?
Because I love crisps. For starters, salt and vinegar all the way. But also, it's one of those. Say again.
We'll let you have that. That was a very controversial debate about what flavour crisps
it is a controversial.
Eating.
That's why I got in there quick. Tyrrell salt and vinegar crisps. So if they want to send me some, that's fine with me. I'm happy to endorse. But it's one of those words that's like an onomatopoeia, isn't it? It sounds crisp. It sounds like the thing it is.
Yes.
So I like that word. And also, it's easier to spell than discombobulated, isn't it?
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
Just a little bit. I think that's actually a really good place for us to wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone can see there's a little link that's popped up just below. You can buy Emma's books. Please do go and buy all of them. Buy multiple copies. Buy them for your friends and families and schools because they are fantastic. Once again, thank you to Emma for joining us. So a silent big round of applause from everyone. Just imagine that.
Thank you everybody who's been online, and I'm really sorry if it was echoey. And somebody's just said I hate salt and vinegar, so I think you've won there. And if you want to just hang on a minute, look who's just turned up. Woo! It's a Jack Russell. Hooray! There's Bertie.
Oh, I love Jack Russell.
And there's Olive. There you go.
Hi, Emma. It's Richard here. I love Jack Russell. I used to have one. Just one last question from me. What are you working on? What are you working on next, Emma? What's your next book, and when can we expect to see
thank you very much, guys.
Well,
lovely to see you all. Bye-bye.
I think that's it. Thank you, Emma. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.